Hello everyone, my name is Ramon and I'll be presenting with Helen Senk our case study on exploring confirmation bias in the consumption of news media during the 2019 South American protests. Just for a bit of context, the 2019 South American protests were a series of protests that shocked the region at the end of 2019. These protests also had in common a massive online presence and the reported involvement of international and regional actors that sought to influence the evolution of the different protests. These actors were mainly from Russia and were mainly funded by Russia and Venezuela. For this purpose, we collected Twitter data across different countries. More than 500 hashtags and terms were used for each of the countries. This resulted in over 100 million tweets from more than 10 million users. A special effort was taken to collect conversations around antagonistic positions, by including hashtags that were used by the different groups, both for and against the different governments. For a bit of context of each of the events that transpired in each country, we can see that the first country affected was Ecuador. Their protest started as a response of an International Monetary Fund sponsored austerity package, which involved the rise in fuel costs. Protests occurred between mid-September to mid-October of that year. Then, in Chile, violent anti-government protests started because of the rise of the cost of subway tickets in Santiago. Protests were ongoing from October to December of that year. In Bolivia, the protests were sparked demanding the nullification of the presidential elections, as a result, the president resigned from office. The protests started in October 21 and lasted until November of that year. And finally, in Colombia, the protests started as a response of economic and political reforms proposed by the current president. They began on November 21st and lasted until January of 2020. We seek to quantify the effect of confirmation bias on the consumption of news articles based on the stance of the users on Twitter. The current fractionalized way of consuming news facilitated by social media not only helps us gain a quicker overview of current events, but it can also lead to confirmation bias. We ground our analysis on social identity theory, a theory that posits that people seek information that presents their group on a favorable way. Most of the research that has tackled this problem, however, has focused on the cognitive aspects of confirmation bias, while neglecting the social dimensions of the phenomenon. Our study tries to fill this gap. To determine the stance of the users towards the protest, we first classified a base set of hashtags into either pro, anti, or neutral to the protest, based on a sample of the tweets that used them throughout the dataset. This resulted in more than 120 pro and 300 anti-government hashtags, the remainder being either neutral or not a hashtag. This set was expanded by classifying the most important co-occurring hashtags. Noisy stance labels were assigned to tweets based on their previous hashtag users. Users were only assigned the label if they used tags for one side of the argument only, either under tweets or under user description. If a user either retweeted or tweeted a hashtag that was inconsistent, then the user wasn't assigned a stance. In this slide, we present the user-by-user response network based on only the users that were assigned a consistent stance. Here, two users are connected if they either replied or quoted each other. As we see, the data naturally clusters based on the stance, where most of the interactions between pro-government users occur within the group, although there is an important interaction between the groups. We see similar results for Chile and Colombia. We also classify the stance of users towards Venezuela by applying a similar methodology as before. For this purpose, we selected a set of hashtags that had a clear stance towards Venezuela, but that weren't related to the protests that transpired in each of the countries. We see that most of the users didn't tweet something containing those hashtags, but the ones that did aligned clearly with the stance that supported the protests in each of the countries, with the exception of Bolivia, where, as expected, the government that was being ousted was a regional partner of Venezuela, and most of the accounts that supported the government were the ones that engaged in the pro-Venezuelan campaign. We see similar results in Chile and Colombia, where again, most of the accounts that were pro-Venezuela were also for the protest and against the local governments. Now, Helen will continue with our study in news media consumption and its polarization.
Thanks, Ramon. To characterize news consumption of users with different stances, we construct a dataset of foreign and local news agencies for each country. The table here illustrates the number of agencies from different countries in our analysis. We construct the network for a news agency based on the homogeneity of their user base. We first use an adjacency matrix to construct the bipartite network of users and news agencies. A is a matrix where each row is a user and each column is a news agency with its entry Aij equal to 1 if user I retweet J's post. Then the grouping network M equal to A transpose times A would be a matrix with its entry M, M, N, the number of users shared by news agency M and N. With this matrix, we are now able to perform the cluster. We perform Louvain community detection, and the graph here demonstrates the network for each country. Each dot here is a news agency, while the same color represents a cluster. H here means that the two news agencies share common users. After clustering, we notice that the Louvain community detection helps us to have 3 clusters of each country, with one mostly local media, the second one regional Russian and Venezuelan media, and the last one local Venezuelan media. We could see from the results that news media with similar founding background or stances have more homogeneous user base. We further use the statistic, the percentage of retweets from pro-government users to evaluate the user base for news agencies in different clusters. The graph on the left shows the news agency in one of the 3 clusters, mainly local media, while the one on the right shows another cluster, mainly foreign media. Because of time constraint, we only show the results of country Bolivia. The foreign media shows more support to left-leaning government, which is the stance of Bolivia government. We see higher percentage of information diffusion come from pro-government users for foreign media, which align with our analysis. Local media have more retweets from anti-government users. The polarization is prominent in Bolivia. The statistic used here has limitation because we have an unbalanced data set with roughly 80% of users are anti-government. The next step of this project is to construct a better statistic which would help us to tackle with this issue. To sum up, we find that the user discussion based on response clearly clustered according to the stance of the users. There is an important presence of accounts that promote the Venezuela government. We're able to cluster a news agency based on the homogeneity of their user base. We find considerable polarization of media consumption based on the user stance. That's everything. Thank you very much.